March the 6th, 1944. 23,000 feet over Germany. The sky was a hard steel blue canvas, and a B-17 flying fortress called Hell's Fury rode through it like a grim promise. In the cramped, sweltering tail position, Staff Sergeant Michael "Mad Mike" Donovan watched 12 Messerschmitt BF-109s peel into formation, and felt the old familiar animal rush that had kept him breathing all his life. The same savage instinct that had seen him through South Boston street fights and winter docks. The training manuals said, fall back, conserve ammunition, stay alive long enough to bring the airplane home. The doctrine of survival etched into every gunnery lesson emphasized measured bursts, discipline, economies of fire. But Donovan had a different calculus. If you waited to be shot, you might live 10 seconds longer, and you'd still be dead. So he learned to rewrite the rules on the fly, to turn the most vulnerable spot on the bomber into its deadliest defensive weapon. And on that clear March morning, he proved the lesson to a watching world in 4 brutal minutes that would force Allied air commanders to rethink everything about defending heavy bombers. Donovan's life before the war explains the fury that would become doctrine. A kid from a neighborhood where hesitation got you hurt, where his father's hands smelled of oil and rope, and he learned by watching men who refused to be soft that waiting was surrender. So when the Army Air Forces offered him a place on the ground crews, he pushed for gunnery school until they gave in, and the instructors who criticized him for being too forward were the same men who one day would train others using the tactics he refined under fire. Because Donovan didn't learn to shoot to save targets. He learned to shoot to end threats before they finished forming. And that ethos becomes the first sentence of what we now know as the Donovan Doctrine. Hell's Fury had been in trouble before she took off from Framlingham. Her previous tail gunner had walked away, saying the position was cursed. Crews called for transfers and whispered about ironies and fate. But Donovan volunteered without hesitation, and Captain James Whitmore, a combat-hardened skipper, weighed the statistics and shrugged. "You're insane," he said. "You'll fit right in." And so the bomber climbed and climbed until the ground fell away and the German heartland stretched under them like a stitched map. And when the call came, fighters at 6 o'clock high, 12 bandits, Donovan didn't do what the manual insisted. He didn't wait for them to come within optimal ranges. He opened fire at 2,000 yards. Not because he trusted those rounds to kill, but because he believed in the psychology of violence. The hard arithmetic that showed a burst at indiscriminate range could break formation discipline, and thus save lives. And the impact was immediate. Tracers arced like hot spiderwebs through the morning air, and the German box, used to approaching as a single instrument, cracked at the seams. Pilots hesitated. Lead aircraft wavered. Wingmen checked their 6, and in that hesitation Donovan landed the first true blows, timing his sustained bursts to hit the wingman, the one who never expects return fire because he is taught to watch the leader. His second mission a few days earlier had taught him that attacking the predictable wingman unmoored entire attack patterns. He'd used ammunition with abandon then, burning nearly 80% of his belt on a sortie. But the result had been no hits on their bomber and a shaken attacker. Murphy, the crew chief, counted rounds like a miser and cursed, then grinned when the bomber returned intact, because every tracer that missed but pulled a German out of the run was worth more than 100 rounds conserved while a plane burned. Donovan's aim was not to be a marksman. It was to be a demoralizer, and on March 6th, he refined that method into a doctrine. The first volley at extreme range scattered the first 12 into broken, hesitant orbits. Then within minutes, more pilots stitched back together, until one veteran, too experienced to be cowed by distant tracers, made the mistake of pressing home. Donovan let him close, then switched from warning fire to total volume. A 3-second, 200-round torrent that detonated the Messerschmitt's engine like an oven of shrapnel. And the twin 50s that normally were supposed to fend only narrowly at point-blank range had become the hammer of an entirely new kind of air combat. When other fighters reformed and attacked, Donovan concentrated, refusing to divide his attention, calling to the waist gunners to cover other vectors while he locked onto the primary throat of the assault. And where Doctrine had recommended measured bursts and economized patience, he chose maximum, terrifying violence. 3 aircraft in 30 seconds, then another pair. Each kill not only destroying metal and man, but eroding the enemy's nerve. And soon 12 German fighters were falling out of the sky around Hell's Fury, without a single crew casualty on the bomber. A ratio of blood and iron that should have been impossible in the thin, brutal mathematics of air war. The Germans tried new tactics, shadowing at a distance, probing for weaknesses, massing in larger numbers. And Donovan answered by striking before their arrays could congeal, opening fire into the central geometry of the enemy formation to destabilize command and create disorder. And where mass once guaranteed coordinated strikes, violence turned the mass into confusion. Tracers that didn't aim to kill immediately, nonetheless forced pilots into evasive action, into collisions, into aborted runs. And that psychological effect, fear of being the one who breaks the pattern and therefore becomes meat in the air, multiplied the physical damage many times over. More than once, whole planned attacks dissolved because someone in the enemy box saw the telltale early fire and thought, maybe this one is different. Maybe that bomber's tail is a wall of death. And then the attack plan is discarded in a moment of self-preservation, which, measured over dozens of missions, turns into reduced bomber losses and a strategic advantage. The moment when Donovan poured a catastrophic barrage into the center of a 48-plane forming and watched them fragment like a school of fish hit by a net is now a study in tactical psychology. Violence as preemption, fear as force multiplier, initiative as armor. And in those seconds, when his 30 seconds of hell scattered enemy ranks, he bought time. A commodity more precious than ammunition, for his group and for the entire formation to reorganize and press on. And the moral calculus was blunt. He burned through 2,000 rounds to save 9 lives and an aircraft, and the 1,000 pounds of odds that would otherwise have killed them. Hell's Fury limped home hours later with nearly 50 bullet holes, a snapped hydraulic line, and a crew shaken but alive. And Donovan, oddly calm, sat on the tarmac like any other enlisted man, while others stared at the shattered silhouette of what they'd just lived through, and asked themselves how one gunner had turned a fearful statistic into a new survivability metric. Whitmore and Murphy tallied the kills and confirmations. A dozen confirmed, several probables. But the number meant less than the lesson that spread like a heat wave through Framlingham, and then through the 8th Air Force. Aggression worked, and it worked because it violated the enemy's plan before they could finish forming it. Word reached headquarters quickly. Major General Frederick Anderson came in person to meet the man who had upended assumptions. And rather than keep Donovan and risk burning him out on combat tours, Anderson reassigned him to training, a brutal acknowledgement that the man who could do the most to save lives in the aggregate would save fewer lives if he kept pouring his courage into single sorties. And Donovan accepted without fanfare, because the arithmetic of service was simple to him. 9 crewmen saved in one mission was nothing next to 3,000 saved over an entire bomber campaign. Thus began the Donovan training program, a 2-week crucible that sought to graft the aggressive instinct onto those who could remain calm enough to be controlled and ruthless enough to take the initiative. Not everyone could be taught to embrace risk, and many washed out, unable to replace the defensive reflex with disciplined attack. But those who succeeded learned 5 brutal principles. Seize initiative. Engage during enemy formation. Concentrate your fire where it inflicts maximum psychological and physical damage. Use aggression as ammunition economy rather than waste. And accept personal risk to reduce collective loss. These were not platitudes, but practical rules that reshaped engagement statistics. And the numbers that followed are as quiet and eloquent as any military victory. Tail gunner casualty rates in the 8th Air Force dropped from roughly 38% to 23% as aggressive shooting spread. The completion rate of German fighter attack runs against bomber formations fell from over 50% to roughly 27%. And bomber losses per 1,000 sorties plummeted in the months after Donovan's methods were taught across groups. Evidence that the doctrine's ripple effect was more than anecdote. It was measurable survival. German after-action reports later captured the enemy's bewilderment. Pilots complained that American tail gunners engaged during approach phase with sustained fire, causing disruption of attack coordination, and recommended avoiding stern attacks and seeking high-angle, more complex approaches. Recommendations that, in the heat of combat, were often impractical and costly for a Luftwaffe struggling with pilot shortages and truncated training. And so the Donovan Doctrine effectively turned fear back on the attacker, reversing what had been a grim arithmetic that favored the aggressor and replacing it with an equation where the defender, through controlled violence, could intimidate and disperse the offensive force. Donovan himself never sought glory. After he trained hundreds of tail gunners and watched his teachings multiply across squadrons, he slipped away from combat and returned to Boston, where he hammered together a life of construction and family, and refused interviews for decades, insisting simply that he did what needed doing, while veterans who learned from him kept alive the memory of his lesson at informal gatherings and slow, private toasts. Those men, Bailey, Chen, Murphy, and hundreds more, spoke in bars and reunions of the doctrine that saved their lives and the lives of comrades, and historians later quantified their impact. Conservative studies attribute the Donovan training and aggressive gunnery methods with preventing hundreds of bombers from being lost and saving thousands of aircrew. Numbers that read like quiet miracles when set against the raw brutality of strategic bombing campaigns. The concept of acting early to disrupt enemy coordination also echoed into post-war doctrine and taught generations of airmen and gunners that defense is not passive, and that the psychology of fear can be molded into a weapon as tangible as iron and lead. February and March 1944 were pivot points because they proved one stubborn truth on a scale. Tactics change outcomes, and individual initiative, when disciplined and multiplied, becomes doctrine. And the man from South Boston who never waited for a punch rewrote how bombers survived the bloodiest skies of the European War. When Donovan died in 1998, he left no monuments in marbled squares, no parades timed to his exploits. Newspapers printed a short obituary that mentioned service and family and tucked the story of March 6th into a single terse paragraph. Yet the men who owed him their lives turned up in small crowds to lift a glass in a dark tavern and remember how one tail gunner's refusal to be prey had turned him into an instrument of collective survival. Because the war, at its core, is an accounting of choices. Some lived alone in high-metal tails, and others taught to thousands. And Donovan's choice to shoot first and ask questions later was neither reckless nor heroic in some romantic sense. It was terrifically pragmatic, brutal, and humane in that it maximized the chances that a bomber crew would see the wreathing green of England again. The Donovan Doctrine's enduring lesson applies beyond tail guns and steel skies. In any defensive posture, initiative can convert vulnerability into strength. And the moral of Hell's Fury's fight over Augsburg is that sometimes survival requires you to stop waiting for the bullet and make the enemy decide he cannot risk the shot. Because once you force him to choose, you have already won. March 6th lasted 4 minutes, but its consequences measured decades. Aggressive defense became a recognized combat principle. Tail gunners were trained to behave like predators instead of prey. Bomber formations learned to exploit psychological deterrence as much as flak belts. And the ripples of that decision can be followed through Cold War doctrine and into modern aerial combat teachings, where early, decisive engagement remains a bedrock tenet. Michael Donovan's life after the war was quiet. The man who rewrote aerial survival returned to a life of carpentry, family, and the humble rhythm of ordinary labor. But every time a transport aircraft trains its gunners to seize initiative, or a night convoy learns to strike first to prevent ambush, a little of Donovan's lesson is alive. A single tail gunner, 2,000 rounds, a dozen enemy fighters, 3,000 lives saved by one man's choice to hunt rather than be hunted. A moment when a street fighter's intuition became a military doctrine that saved thousands. And when you watch footage of B-17s cutting across the sky, you might imagine the cramped tail, the reverberation of twin 50s, the abrupt silence when tracers stop a formation and the enemy scatters. And if that image moves you, remember the quiet man who taught a service that aggression, when disciplined and directed, is not mere bloodlust, but a calculated instrument of preservation. Michael Donovan fired first, changed the air war, and in doing so, taught the world that survival often begins with refusing to be still.